She was 19 and homeless. Not the dramatic kind of homeless that makes a news story, just the quiet working kind where her mother's new boyfriend made it clear after a Sunday dinner that a grown daughter living in a two-bedroom apartment above a Hungarian bakery was no longer going to be part of his arrangement with her mother. Elena Novak had been born in that apartment. She had learned to walk on the worn oak floors that ran between the small kitchen and the smaller living room. She had grown up with the smell of rising yeast dough coming through the floorboards at 4 in the morning, when the bakers downstairs fired the ovens for the day's first batch of Hungarian sweetbread. The apartment sat above Kovacs Bakery on Tilghman Street in Allentown, Pennsylvania, in a neighborhood where the signs on the storefronts were still half in Hungarian and half in English, where old men still gathered on Saturday mornings to drink Turkish coffee and argue about football matches played in cities they had not seen in 40 years. Elena's mother, Katerina, had come to Allentown from a village outside Debrecen in 1996, at the age of 22. 22 on a work visa arranged by a cousin who had emigrated to Pennsylvania in the early 80s. The cousin had set Katerina up with a job at the bakery and with the apartment above it. Katerina had been at both the job and the apartment every day of Elena's childhood. Elena's father was a man Katerina had met her first year in Allentown, a second-generation Hungarian-American mechanic named Andrei Horvath, who had disappeared 6 months after Elena was born. Not dramatically, not with shouting, just an ordinary, slow disappearance across the 6 months in which he had come home less and less, and had finally one Saturday morning in July not come home at all. Katerina had never filed any legal paperwork. She had simply removed his clothes from the closet and his razor from the bathroom, and had raised Elena alone. The center of Elena's childhood was her grandmother Magda, who had come to Allentown in 2002, when Elena was 4, because Katerina had begun to understand that raising a child alone in a foreign country while working 40 hours a week at a bakery was not something a woman could do without help. Magda had been 81 years old. She had not wanted to leave Hungary. She had come anyway because her daughter had asked her to. She moved into the small third bedroom above the bakery and spent the next 14 years of her life in that room, cooking Hungarian dishes in Katerina's kitchen, walking Elena to and from school and telling Elena stories about the Novak and Horvath families going back 4 generations. The stories Magda told most often were about Elena's great-grandfather, Magda's own father, a man named Joseph Novak who had emigrated from the same village outside Debrecen in 1919 and had landed in Bethlehem with $11 and a pastor's letter of introduction. Joseph had become a teamster. He had driven a 4-horse beer wagon for a Bethlehem brewery until Prohibition closed it. In 1923, a 4-horse grain wagon for a Lancaster County feed mill until 1929, and a 2-horse butcher's delivery wagon in Allentown until 1941, when the last commercial horse-drawn wagon in his part of Pennsylvania had been retired, and Joseph had taken a job as a textile mill foreman. He would hold for the last 17 years of his working life. Joseph had died in 1972. Elena had therefore never known him, but Magda had known him. She had been his daughter, born in 1921. And Magda had grown up in a Bethlehem row house with a man who had spent 22 years driving working teams and who had never in his remaining 29 years of life stopped talking about them. Magda had passed those stories to Elena across Elena's childhood, and Elena had grown up inside the specific lore of turn-of-the-century Pennsylvania teamstering without having ever, in her own life, touched a draft horse. Magda had kept on the wall above her small twin bed a framed display of 31 harness brasses. Small polished bronze medallions stamped with designs of horses and grain sheaves and brewery wagons, each one from a specific animal of Joseph's working teams. Károly István Lajos, Jolán Margit Erzsébet, and 25 others. Magda had recited the 31 names to Elena, the way certain old women recited the names of saints, as a daily discipline, as an act that kept the animals alive by saying them. Elena had learned the names by the time she was 6. She had learned how to read a Hungarian teamster's daybook. By the time she was 11, after Magda had taught her the alphabet and the basic vocabulary of the old trade. Kochisi for driver, ham for harness, istalo for stable, zab for oats. Magda died when Elena was 18. She had simply stopped waking up one Tuesday morning in September, at the age of 96. The funeral had been held at the same Hungarian-American Lutheran church in Bethlehem, where Magda's father Joseph had been buried in 1972. Elena had read a short passage from the Hungarian Lutheran hymn book at the funeral in her grandmother's language, a language Elena had come to think of as her own second language, even though she would never hear it spoken on a Tilghman Street sidewalk again. 6 weeks after Magda's funeral, Katerina brought home a man named Garrett Keller, a 53-year-old contractor, twice divorced. He had made it clear to Katerina, according to what Katerina told Elena on the Saturday evening after the introduction, that he was willing to support her in a more comfortable way than the bakery could, but that the arrangement would require a reorganization of the household. Elena had understood that Saturday evening that the reorganization was going to involve her leaving. She had asked her mother directly, "Do you want me to move out?" Katerina had not answered immediately. Katerina had stood at the kitchen counter with her hands in a bowl of rising dough, her back to Elena, and had stared at the small clay pot of rosemary on the windowsill for a long moment. "I want you to have your own life," Katerina had said. "I want for you what my own mother wanted for me when she let me leave Debrecen. And I want for the first time in 24 years to have a man in this apartment who is not leaving." Elena had understood. She had not liked it, but she had understood. She had given her mother 3 weeks' notice. She had worked every double shift at the diner on Hamilton Street, where she had waited tables since she was 16. She had sold her textbooks and her old bicycle for $218 at a second-hand shop. And she had taken down Magda's framed display of 31 harness brasses, wrapped each one in tissue paper, and packed them carefully into a wooden wine crate from the bakery. Her mother had said yes without looking up from the kitchen counter. Elena had packed the rest of her belongings into 2 suitcases and a duffel bag, along with Joseph's original Teamster's daybook, and a framed photograph of Magda at age 29, standing in front of a bay team in a Bethlehem stable yard. She had $847 in her savings account the morning she left. No car, and a cousin in Reading, Pennsylvania who had offered her a couch. She had taken a regional rail ticket to Reading for $22 and had slept on the cousin's couch for 3 weeks, during which she had applied for 17 waitressing jobs and had been hired for none of them. On a cold Friday evening in early November, Elena had sat on the cousin's couch with her laptop and the wine crate of harness brasses beside her on the rag rug, and she had opened the Lancaster County surplus property page, a thing she had bookmarked during her 3rd week at the cousin's apartment during a night. She could not sleep. She had scrolled through the listings without any particular plan. The night before, she had done something she had not done since Magda's funeral. She had opened Joseph's old Teamster's daybook, the one Magda had carried from Hungary in 2002. The one Magda had read aloud to Elena on Saturday afternoons when Elena was small enough to sit on her grandmother's lap. The daybook was written in a mix of Hungarian and broken English and a kind of phonetic German that Joseph had picked up from the Pennsylvania Dutch teamsters he had worked alongside in the Lancaster feed mills. The handwriting was careful and slanted. The entries were short. Daily records of loads, hauled horses worked, weather conditions, payments received. Elena had not been looking for anything in particular. She had simply wanted to hear her grandmother's voice again, in the only way she had left. And then, on the inside back cover of the daybook, she had found something she had never noticed before. A page of thin paper had been glued to the inside of the back cover. The paper had yellowed with age, and the glue had dried to the texture of old leather. But when Elena had carefully peeled the page away from the cover, she had found a list. 6 addresses written in pencil in Joseph's careful, slanted hand. 6 addresses of carriage houses and stables in Lancaster County. And beside each address, a short note in Hungarian or German. The 3rd address on the list read, Fisher Carriage House, Stumptown Road, 2.1 acres, $10 county, T, surplus. And beside it, in Joseph's hand, JF 1929, Der ehrliche Mann, the honest man. Elena had sat on the couch for a long time with the list in her hand. She had opened her laptop. She had typed Fisher Carriage House, Lancaster County into the search bar. The listing had come up on the first page. Lancaster County surplus property. Fisher Carriage House, Stumptown Road, Eastern Lancaster County. Approximately 3,800 square feet of enclosed space on a 2.1 acre parcel. Hand-laid limestone foundation. Heavy oak timber frame construction. Slate roof with patches of missing slate at the north peak. The building had been built in 1892 by a commercial teamster named Jacob Fisher. It had passed out of the Fisher family in 1971, been tax forfeited to the county in 1994, and listed on the Lancaster County surplus page at $10 since 2007. The photograph showed a magnificent Pennsylvania bank barn-style structure with thick limestone walls, weathered oak siding on the upper story, a steep slate roof, and a tall central sliding stable door on the uphill side. The building sat on a small knoll at the back of an old field that had clearly not been plowed in decades. Elena had looked at the photograph for a long time. She had thought about her great-grandfather Joseph. She had thought about the 31 harness brasses in the wine crate beside her. She had thought about her grandmother Magda, who had told her the last time Magda had spoken to her before the stroke that had taken her mind for the final 5 days of her life, that a Novak woman was never finished with horses, just because she had not been given any. Elena bought a regional rail ticket to Lancaster the following Monday for $22. The Lancaster County surplus property clerk was a woman in her late 50s named Ruth Yoder. She had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone as the old Pennsylvania farmhouses. High cheekbones, clear gray eyes, hair pulled back in a tight bun at the base of her neck. She pulled the file for the Stumptown Corners carriage house and raised her eyebrows. "Miss, that building has been listed at $10 for 17 years. The foundation has shifted in 3 places. The roof has slate missing. There is no electricity, no water, no septic. Do you understand what you are buying, yes, ma'am?" Ruth had the specific, unhurried gaze of a small county clerk who had seen a great many people walk into her office intending to do foolish things. "May I ask why you want it?" "My great-grandfather was a teamster. He drove working teams in Pennsylvania from 1920 until 1941. I was raised by his daughter. I have been carrying 31 of his harness brasses around in a wine crate for a month. I need a wall to hang them on." Ruth Yoder did not answer for a moment. "What was your great-grandfather's name?" "Joseph Novak of Bethlehem." Ruth set the file down on the desk very carefully. "Miss Novak, my own grandfather Abraham Yoder was the head hay handler at the Fisher grain mill from 1918 to 1946. He knew every Hungarian teamster who worked the Allentown to Lancaster feed runs. He mentioned a Joseph Novak of Bethlehem to me once when I was a child. He called him der ehrliche Ungar, the honest Hungarian." Elena said nothing. Ruth Yoder stamped the deed slowly, carefully, in the way a county clerk stamps a document when she has understood that what is happening in front of her is a thing she will tell her husband about at the supper table that evening, and that her husband will tell to the table at his grandchildren's birthday party the following Sunday. She handed Elena a heavy iron ring with 3 keys on it. The large key is the main stable door. The medium key is the hayloft door. The small key is the tack room behind the main stable. The nearest hardware store is in Intercourse, 12 miles east. Mr. Byler at the dairy down the lane will pull you out of a snowbank in the winter without asking for payment. My own phone number is on the back of the deed." She paused. "Welcome home, Miss Novak." Elena walked out of the county office with the heavy iron ring and the folded deed, and the deep settled feeling that the next hour of her life was going to be more important than the previous 19 years of it combined. She hired a taxi for $34 to drive her from the Lancaster train station out to Stumptown Corners and the last 2.5 miles of farm lane to the carriage house. The driver waited at the end of the lane while Elena walked up the rise to the building with the iron ring in her hand and the wine crate of harness brasses in her arms. The carriage house stood on the knoll at the top of the field exactly as the photograph had shown it. Hand-laid limestone walls rising 12 feet on the lower story, oak board and batten siding on the upper hayloft story. A steep slate roof with the north peak slates missing in patches. The tall central sliding stable door painted a faded barn red that had oxidized to the color of dried apple. A small limestone mounting block sat beside the door where the teamsters had once stepped up to the height, needed to buckle a collar on a 17-hand percheron. Elena set the wine crate of harness brasses down on the mounting block and put the large key into the heavy iron lock of the central sliding door. The lock was stiff. She worked it for a long minute. The lock turned. The door slid on its iron track reluctantly with a deep wooden groan that traveled the length of the building, and opened. She stepped inside. The interior was enormous. A ground floor of hand-laid limestone walls and a hard-packed clay and straw floor, with 6 massive oak stalls running down both sides of the central aisle. Each stall was timber framed in oak beams hewn with an adze. Each half door hung on hand-forged iron hinges. Each stall floor dropped 3 inches below the aisle for drainage. At the far end of the central aisle, a wide oak staircase climbed to the hayloft. Beside the staircase, a small tack room door stood in the limestone wall. Dust floated in the narrow shafts of light, coming through the 3 narrow windows high on the north wall. The air smelled faintly of old oak and stone, and a ghost of hay from 54 autumns ago. Elena walked the central aisle slowly, one stall at a time. At the door of each stall, a small oak plaque had been nailed at eye level. Each plaque bore a carved name. She read them as she walked. König, Kaiser, Wolfgang, Augusta, Frida, Hannah. 6 stalls, 6 German names, 6 draft horses who had lived at the Fisher carriage house in the final years of its working life, before Samuel Fisher had retired his last team in 1963. Elena stood at the door of each stall for a moment. She thought about her grandmother Magda's discipline, the recitation of the 31 Hungarian names, and she understood in that moment in the limestone aisle that Samuel Fisher had clearly felt the same obligation toward his 6 Mennonite teams that Joseph Novak had felt toward his Hungarian ones. That a specific human obligation toward name-working animals was a thing that crossed every language and every border and every religion. She climbed the wide oak staircase to the hayloft. The hayloft was a single enormous open space, with a low-pitched oak rafter ceiling and 2 small gable-end windows. The plank floor was thick with 54 years of settled hay dust. A heavy oak hay pulley hung from the ridge beam, still threaded with its original rope, which had stiffened like a dried branch. Elena walked the length of the hayloft slowly. The dust she stirred rose in slow gold columns in the weak November light. At the north end of the loft, against the gable end, was a wall. Wood plank, vertical tongue, and groove siding. The kind of interior wall a teamster would build to divide off a small office or tack room annex at the back of his working loft. The wall ran maybe 8 feet across. Elena approached the wall. She ran her hand along the planks. The planks were tongue and groove, old hand-fitted, clearly built by a careful craftsman. She counted the planks from left to right. The wall was 11 planks wide. At the join between the seventh and eighth planks, she noticed that the seam was slightly wider than the seams on either side. The nails along the eighth plank were missing at the top and bottom. She worked her fingers into the seam at the top of the eighth plank. The plank moved slightly. She pulled steadily. The plank came loose, not with violence, but in the careful, slow way a plank comes loose when it has been specifically designed to be removable by someone who knew which one to pull. The plank lifted out clean. Behind the plank was an opening, a shallow compartment about 2 feet wide, 3 feet tall, and 4 inches deep, built into the space between the back of the false wall and the actual gable end of the building. Inside the compartment, laid carefully on a folded square of oilcloth that had yellowed with age, were 4 objects. A leather-bound daybook, much larger than the one Joseph Novak had kept, stamped in faded gold on the cover, Fisher Teamster's Account 1892 onward. A canvas grain bag closed with the drawstring heavy with the weight of metal. A small oak box the size of a cigar box with a brass clasp, and a folded envelope of heavy cream paper, sealed with brown wax, addressed in a slanted old Pennsylvania Dutch hand. For the nächsten Stallmeister. For the next stable master. Elena stood very still in the dusty November light of the hayloft. She thought about her grandmother Magda, teaching her the 31 names when she was 6 years old, teaching her to read Joseph's daybook when she was 11, teaching her without ever saying it directly that the discipline of remembering was the only thing that kept the past from disappearing. She thought about Joseph in 1929 meeting a German teamster named Jakob Fischer, somewhere on a feed run between Bethlehem and Lancaster. 2 men who spoke different languages, but who understood the same thing. That a horse's name mattered. That saying the name was what kept the animal alive after the animal was gone. And she thought about Samuel Fisher in 1963, the last teamster at this carriage house, sealing this compartment into the back of his hayloft with his own hands, building a hiding place for the things he could not bring himself to burn or sell or give away, waiting for someone who would understand. Elena carried the 4 objects down the oak staircase and out to the mounting block in the fading afternoon light. She set them beside the wine crate of 31 harness brasses, and she sat down on the cold limestone step, and she opened them one at a time. The daybook was 71 years of teamstering accounts. Every load of grain hauled, every brewery run, every horse bought, and retired every farrier appointment. Every day from May 1892 through the final entry dated April 17, 1963. 3 generations of Fishers had kept it. Jakob from 1892 to 1938. Samuel from 1938 to 1963. And one brief period in 1917 when Jacob's younger brother, Matthias, kept the book while Jacob recovered from a kick to the ribs delivered by a Percheron mare named Gerda. Elena turned to the last entry, April 17, 1963, written in a shaking, slanted hand. Today I retired my last team. Hannah went to a rescue in Ohio where she will be cared for until she passes. I am 66 years old. My father and I have kept teams at this carriage house for 71 years. I am the last of us. I do not know what I will do tomorrow. S. Fisher. Elena closed the book and set it on her knees for a long moment. She opened the canvas grain bag next. Inside were silver coins. She counted them slowly. 92 Morgan and Peace silver dollars, mostly from the 1890s through the 1920s. The dates matching the years of Jacob Fisher's working prime. The silver content alone would later appraise at about $2,100. The collector value, because the coins had been carefully chosen and were in remarkable condition, would come to just over $11,400. She opened the small oak box. Inside, nestled in a bed of aged cotton batting, were 6 harness brasses. Solid bronze, 2 inches across, beautifully stamped with designs of grain sheaves and wagon wheels and plow blades polished to a dark honey color. Each one was stamped on the back with a small oak leaf maker's mark and a name: König, Kaiser, Wolfgang, Augusta, Frida, Hannah. 6 brasses, 6 horses, the last working team. Elena picked up the Hannah brass. She held it in her palm for a long time. Her own grandmother's name had been Magda, not Hannah. But the weight of the brass in her hand felt the same as the weight of the 31 brasses in the wine crate beside her. The weight of a name that someone had decided mattered enough to preserve. She opened the wax-sealed envelope last. The wax cracked cleanly. The paper inside was heavy. The handwriting was the same slanted Pennsylvania Dutch hand as the final daybook entry. To the next stable master. My name is Samuel Fisher. I am writing this on the evening of April 17th, 1963. The day I retired my last team. My father, Jacob, built this carriage house in 1892. He and I between us have kept working draft horses here for 71 years. My father passed in 1952. I am 66 years old and have no surviving children. My only son, Eli, died in World War II Pacific Theater in 1945 at the age of 20. My wife, Rebecca, died of cancer in 1958. There is no one to take on the work after me. I am sealing this daybook and this silver, and these 6 harness brasses in a compartment I built myself behind a false plank wall at the north end of my hayloft, which I have constructed this week as my last act of carpentry in this building. I have built it because I cannot bring myself to burn the daybook. I cannot bring myself to deposit the silver in a bank I do not trust. And I cannot bring myself to give the 6 brasses of my last team to the Mennonite Historical Society in Lititz, who would catalog them and display them in a glass case beside other teamsters' brasses, and who would not know the specific names of the specific animals who wore them for the last 14 years of my working life. The 6 brasses belong to the 6 horses: König, Kaiser, Wolfgang, Augusta, Frida, and Hannah. König and Kaiser were the leads. Bay Belgian and Chestnut Percheron bought together from the same Berks County farmer in 1949 and worked as a match team from their first hitch. Wolfgang was a gray Percheron gelding of exceptional patience. Augusta was a black Percheron mare of difficult temperament but superb judgment, who once refused to cross a bridge that collapsed under a buckboard 3 days later. Frida was a gray mare of small stature and infinite heart. Hannah was my favorite. A bay Belgian mare with a white blaze and 4 white stockings foaled in 1951, the youngest and gentlest horse I ever worked. I have sent her this afternoon to a rescue in Ohio. It has been the hardest day of my life. If you are reading this letter, you are the person who will continue the carriage house. Whoever you are, I do not know when this compartment will be found. I do not know if it will ever be found. I am trusting because I have no choice that some person will eventually walk into this hayloft and will notice that one plank among 11 is slightly different from its neighbors. A teamster pays attention to small differences. It is the whole basis of the trade. A person who cannot see that a horse's right ear sits half an inch lower today than it did yesterday has no business driving a 4-horse team, because she will not know when the team is asking for help until the team is already hurt. If you notice the 8th plank, you are the person this building has been waiting for. The silver in the grain bag is what my father and I saved personally across 71 years of teamstering. We trusted our own nails in the wall of this hayloft more than any bank. I am leaving it to whoever finds it. Use it to keep the building if you can. Use it for yourself if you cannot keep the building. Use it however you choose. I have no further claim on it. The 6 brasses are not mine to leave to you exactly. They belong to the 6 horses who wore them. I trust that you will keep them on a wall where the 6 horses can be in some way remembered. A name that is not spoken is a name that is going away. I hope whoever reads this understands the distinction. Samuel Fisher Teamster, April 17th, 1963. Elena read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along its old creases and placed it back in the envelope. And she sat very still on the cold limestone mounting block in the fading November light, with the wine crate of her own grandmother's 31 Hungarian harness brasses beside her. And she did not cry. Her grandmother Magda had told her once when Elena was 7 that a Novak woman did not cry on the brasses because the salt would leave a green patina that would never polish out. Elena had been 7 when Magda told her that. She understood now. She said aloud to the empty limestone carriage house and to the 6 oak stalls behind her, and to the specific cold Pennsylvania November air, Cusinum Samuel Baci. Thank you, Uncle Samuel. I will say the names. The rebuilding took patient months. Elena did not spend the $11,400 from the silver on housing. Ruth Yoder's husband, a Pennsylvania Dutch carpenter named Enos, offered her the small 1-bedroom 2nd-floor apartment above his woodworking shop in Stumptown Corners for $85 a month off the books, for as long as she needed it, because his own grandfather had known Joseph Novak from the Lancaster feed runs. Elena had accepted. The apartment was a single room with a kitchenette in one corner and a bathroom smaller than a closet. The windows looked out over a field where nothing had been planted in years. The floor was uneven pine planks that creaked when she walked. The radiator clanked and hissed through the night like something alive. But it was hers, and it was 800 yards from the carriage house. She moved in on a Thursday in late November, with her 2 suitcases in the duffel bag and the wine crate of harness brasses, and the 4 objects from Samuel Fisher's hidden compartment. She set the wine crate on the floor beside her bed. She placed Joseph's daybook and Samuel's daybook side by side on the narrow shelf above the kitchenette counter. She hung Magda's photograph of the Bethlehem stable yard on the wall opposite the bed, so it would be the first thing she saw when she woke. And she went looking for work. The restaurant was a Pennsylvania Dutch family operation 12 miles east in Intercourse, a place called Stoltzfus Family Kitchen that served tourists and locals in equal measure. Chicken pot pie and roast beef and choufle pie and dinner rolls that came to the table still warm from the oven. The owner was a woman in her 60s named Miriam Stoltzfus, who looked at Elena's application and then looked at Elena. You have restaurant experience, 3 years at a diner in Allentown. Why did you leave? I moved here. Why I bought a building? Miriam raised her eyebrows. What kind of building? The old Fisher carriage house on Stumptown Road. Miriam set the application down very carefully. You bought the Fisher place? Yes, ma'am. For $10? Yes, ma'am. Miriam studied her for a long moment. My husband's grandfather worked for Jacob Fisher in the 20s. Drove a wagon team for the grain mill. He told my husband stories about that carriage house his whole life. She picked up the application again. You can start Monday. Dinner shift. 5 to close. $12 an hour plus tips. You keep your own tips. You show up on time. You work clean. You do not call in sick unless you are actually sick. Understand? Yes, ma'am. Welcome to Intercourse, Miss Novak. Elena worked the dinner shift 6 nights a week. She served roast beef to Mennonite families and chicken pot pie to tourists from Philadelphia, and coffee to local farmers who came in after evening milking, and sat at the counter talking about corn prices and the weather. She made roughly $1,800 a month between wages and tips. She paid Enos $85 for rent. She spent another $300 on food and gas for the twice-weekly rides she caught with a coworker who lived near Stumptown. The rest she saved. By the end of December, she had $2,200 in her savings account. On a cold morning between Christmas and New Year, she went back to the pawn shop in Lancaster where she had first taken the silver coins. The owner was the same man who had offered to buy them in November. He looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. You ready to sell? Yes. He counted out the coins again slowly, checked each date, examined each face under a jeweler's loupe. 11,400. Same as before. He wrote her a check. You know what you are selling? Yes, sir. These are collector grade. You could get more if you waited. I need the money now. He nodded. He slid the check across the counter. Whatever you are building, I hope it is worth it. Elena walked out of the pawn shop with the check folded in her jacket pocket and took the bus back to Lancaster County. She deposited the check that afternoon, and the next morning she called Ruth Yoder. Ruth, I need to know what the carriage house needs first. Ruth did not ask why. She simply said, the foundation. 3 sections on the east wall are shifting. Frost heave over 50 years. If you do not address it in the next 2 winters, you will lose part of the stall wall. How much to fix it? If you hire it done, $3,000, maybe more. What if I do it myself? Ruth was silent for a moment. Then she said, "You ever done masonry work?" "No, ma'am." "You know anyone who has?" "No, ma'am." Then you need to learn. And you need to learn from someone who knows Pennsylvania limestone. That stone is 130 years old. You cannot just patch it with modern cement. You will crack the whole wall. She paused. My husband knows a mason, Mennonite man named Isaac Stoltzfus, 71 years old. He has been working limestone foundations since he was 16. If anyone can teach you, it is him. Can you ask him? I can ask. Ruth called back 2 days later. Isaac will meet you at the carriage house Saturday morning at 8. He will look at the foundation and tell you if it can be saved. If he thinks you can learn to fix it, he will teach you. 4 sessions. $200 total. Cash. Elena met Isaac Stoltzfus on a January morning so cold, the ground rang like iron under her boots. He was a small man, compact and weathered, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same limestone he worked. He wore a black wool coat and a flat-brimmed hat, and boots caked with decades of dried mortar. He walked the east wall of the carriage house, slowly running his hands over the stone, tapping individual blocks with the handle of a small hammer, listening to the sound they made. He worked without speaking for 20 minutes. Then he turned to Elena. 3 sections shifted. Here, here, and here. 17 stones loose, 8 cracked. The rest are sound but out of alignment. He tapped one of the bulging stones with the hammer handle. You see this stone? It has moved 1 inch out from the wall face. Does not sound like much. But 1 inch over 50 winters means the mortar joint behind it has failed completely. The stone is held in place only by the weight of the stones above it. When the ground freezes again in 2 weeks, the frost will push it another 1/4 inch. By next winter it will fall. He looked at her. You understand what I am telling you? Yes, sir. Fixing this is not painting a wall. It is not carpentry. Masonry is slow. Masonry is exact. You make a mistake you do not know for 6 months. And then the wall falls. I understand. You have ever mixed mortar? No, sir. You have ever set a stone? No, sir. Isaac studied her for a long moment. Why do you want to learn? Because I cannot afford to hire it done, and because this building has been standing for 130 years and I will not be the one who lets it fall. Isaac nodded slowly. He set his hammer down on the mounting block. 4 sessions. Saturdays, 8 in the morning. You bring gloves, boots, and a notebook. I bring tools. First session is mixing mortar. Second session is removing bad stone. Third session is setting new stone. Fourth session is pointing and finishing. He paused. You do exactly what I say. You do not argue. You do not take shortcuts. You do not get impatient. Understand? Yes, sir. $200. cash. Half, now half, when you finish. Elena handed him 5 $20 bills. Isaac folded the bills into his jacket pocket without counting them. See you Saturday. The first session was mortar. Isaac set up a workbench in the lee of the carriage house out of the wind. He brought 2 bags of lime, a bag of sand, and a 5-gallon bucket. Mortar for limestone is not the same as mortar for brick, he said. Limestone breathes. Modern cement does not breathe. You use cement on old limestone, you trap moisture behind the stone. Moisture freezes. Stone cracks. Wall fails. He poured sand into the bucket, then lime, then water from a jug. Ratio is 3 parts sand to 1 part lime. Water you add slow until the consistency is right. He handed her a mason's hoe. Mix. Elena mixed. The sand and lime clumped and resisted. She added more water. The mixture became soup. Too wet, Isaac said. Start over. She dumped the bucket and started again. This time she added the water in smaller increments, mixing between each addition. The mortar began to come together, thick and smooth. Isaac reached into the bucket with his bare hand and lifted a palmful of mortar. He turned his hand over. The mortar clung to his palm, sagging slightly, but not dripping. This is right. Mortar should fall off the trowel like toothpaste. Not like water. Not like mud. Like toothpaste. He dropped the mortar back into the bucket. You will mix 6 batches today. You will get it wrong 5 times. That is expected. By the 6th batch, you will know the feel. Elena mixed 6 batches. She got it wrong 4 times. By the 6th batch, she could feel the difference in her hands. The second session was removing the damaged stone. Isaac brought a cold chisel, a 2-pound hammer, and a pry bar. You do not remove a stone by hitting the stone. You remove a stone by removing the mortar around the stone. He knelt beside the first bulging section and placed the chisel at the edge of the mortar joint. He tapped the chisel lightly with the hammer. The old mortar crumbled away in small chips. Angle is 30 to 45 degrees. You chisel from the outside edge of the joint inward toward the stone. Never chisel straight into the stone. You will crack it. He worked the joint for 5 minutes, tapping patiently until the mortar around the stone was gone. Then he slid the pry bar behind the stone and levered it gently forward. The stone came out clean, leaving a rectangular void in the wall. Your turn. Lena knelt beside the second loose stone. She placed the chisel at the mortar joint. She tapped. Too hard, Isaac said. You are not breaking concrete. You are removing old lime mortar. It is already half dust. Tap light. Let the chisel do the work. Elena adjusted. She tapped lighter. The mortar began to crumble. She worked for 2 hours on a single stone. Her shoulder ached. Her hand cramped around the hammer handle. But when she finally slid the pry bar behind the stone and levered it forward, the stone came out whole. Isaac nodded. Good. 16 more. The third session was setting stone. Isaac brought a spirit-level trowel and a wooden straight edge. Setting stone is the opposite of removing stone. When you remove, you work fast, and the stone forgives mistakes. When you set, you work slow, and the stone forgives nothing. He picked up one of the stones Elena had removed the previous week. He turned it over in his hands, examining each face. Every stone has a best face. The flattest face goes out. The most square edges go top and bottom. He set the stone down and picked up the trowel. Mortar goes on the back of the stone, the bottom of the stone, and the sides of the stone. Half-inch thick. Even coverage. No gaps. He demonstrated spreading mortar across the back face of the stone with smooth, practiced strokes. Then he lifted the stone and set it into the void in the wall. He pressed it firmly into place. He checked it with the level. He tapped the top edge lightly with the handle of the trowel, adjusting the stone until the bubble in the level sat centered. Level front to back. Level side to side. Flush with the wall face. He stepped back. Your turn. Elena spread mortar on the back of a stone. The mortar was uneven thick in some places and thin in others. Scrape it off and start again, Isaac said. She scraped it off. She spread it again. It was better, but still not even. Again. She scraped and spread 4 times before Isaac nodded. Good enough. Set it. Elena lifted the stone and placed it into the void. She pressed it into place. She checked it with the level. The stone was tilted 3 degrees to the left. She tried to adjust it by pressing on the right edge. The stone shifted but did not level. Take it out, Isaac said. You have to reset it. Once the mortar starts to set, you cannot adjust. You have maybe 3 minutes. Elena pulled the stone out, scraped off the mortar, started again. She reset the stone 5 times before it sat level. Isaac checked her work with the straight edge and the level. He tapped the face of the stone with his knuckles, listening. Good. Next stone. The 4th session was pointing and finishing. Isaac brought a pointing trowel, a stiff brush, and a bucket of clean water. Pointing is the final mortar joint. After the stones are set, you fill the gaps between stones with fresh mortar. The joint should be recessed 1/8 inch from the wall face. This allows rainwater to run down the wall without pooling in the joints. He demonstrated pressing mortar into the joint with the narrow pointing trowel, smoothing it, then using the edge of the trowel to create a shallow recess. After the mortar starts to set 2 to 3 hours depending on temperature, you brush it. Stiff brush. Light pressure. This removes the trowel marks and gives the joint a natural texture. He handed Elena the pointing trowel. The rest is yours. Elena worked alone for the next 8 weeks. She worked Saturdays and Sundays and 2 mornings a week before her dinner shift at the restaurant. She chiseled out the remaining damaged stones. She mixed mortar in the cold, her hands numb even through the gloves. She set stones, checked them with the level, pulled them out, and reset them when they were wrong. Isaac came by once a week, always unannounced. He would sit in a folding chair 20 feet away and watch her work. Occasionally, he would call out a correction. That stone is tilted 2 degrees. Pull it. Mortar too wet. Mix again. Joint too wide. Reset those 4 stones. He never touched the work himself. He only watched and corrected. By the end of March, Elena had reset all 17 stones in the first shifted section. She pointed the joints. She brushed them. She stepped back and looked at her work. The wall was whole again. The stones sat flush and level. The mortar joints were clean and even. Isaac walked up beside her. He ran his hand over the stones. He tapped them with his knuckles. He checked 3 joints with the spirit level. Then he nodded. This will hold. He looked at her. You did good work. Your great-grandfather would be proud. Elena worked through April and May on the 2nd and 3rd shifted sections. The work went faster now. Her hands knew the weight of the stones. Her eye could judge a level joint without the spirit level. She could mix a batch of mortar to the right consistency on the first try. By early June, the foundation was complete. She spent the rest of the money carefully across the summer and fall. $900 to a reclamation yard in Ephrata for enough salvage slate to patch the missing sections of the roof. $400 to reglaze the 3 north wall windows. $200 to rebuild the iron hinges on the 6 stall half doors. Another $300 for materials to convert the small tack room into a climate-controlled workshop. By October, the carriage house was weather-tight. On a Sunday afternoon in late October, Elena brought the 31 Hungarian harness brasses and the 6 German brasses into the tack room. She had built display frames from reclaimed oak, 2 frames side by side on opposite walls. The left frame for Joseph's 31, the right frame for Samuel's 6. She hung each brass carefully, spacing them evenly, arranging them in the order the horses had worked. When she was finished, she stood in the center of the small room and looked at the 2 walls. 37 names. 37 animals. 37 lives that 2 men who had met once on a feed run in 1929 had decided mattered enough to preserve. She thought about that meeting. Josef Novak and Jakob Fischer. 2 teamsters on the same road. 1 Hungarian, 1 German. Neither speaking the other's language fluently, but both understanding the same thing. That evening, after she had closed the tack room and locked the carriage house, Elena went back to her apartment and opened the 2 daybooks side by side on the narrow kitchen table. She had read both books before, but she had never read them together. She started with Joseph's book. She turned the pages slowly, looking for any mention of the Fisher family. And then on a page dated August 14th, 1929, she found it. Lancaster Run. 2 tons oats Bethlehem to Fisher Mill. Met German teamster named Jakob Fischer. Good man. We drink coffee at Miller's Inn. He show me his brass 8 horses. I show him my brass 12 horses. We agree man who does not say horse name is man who does not deserve to drive horse. Elena stared at the entry for a long moment. Then she opened Samuel's daybook. She turned the pages until she found August 1929. August 14th. Hauled 2 tons oats from Bethlehem to Lancaster Mill. Met Hungarian teamster named Joseph Novak, also hauling grain. He calls his horses by name the way my father taught me. We stopped at Miller's Inn for coffee. He showed me his brass's 12 horses' names carved in Hungarian. I showed him mine 8 at that time. We agreed a man who does not speak his horses' names is not worthy to lead them. He gave me a brass from a horse named Istvan, retired in 28. I gave him one from a horse named Wolfgang, died in 27. This is a good tradition. Elena read the entry 3 times. Then she stood up and went to the wine crate where she kept the 31 Hungarian brasses before she had mounted them in the frames. She took out each brass one at a time and examined the back. 8 of the 31 had a small mark she had noticed before, but had not understood. A maker's mark in the shape of an oak leaf. And beside the oak leaf carved in tiny letters, JF 1929. Jakob Fischer. 1929. 8 of Joseph's brasses had come from Jakob Fischer. And somewhere, lost now, one of Jakob's brasses had borne Joseph's mark. The 2 men had not just met on a road in 1929. They had made a pact. They had exchanged the names of their animals. They had agreed to keep those names alive, even after the animals were gone. Elena sat down on the floor of her apartment with the 8 brasses in her lap and understood something she had not understood before. She had not found the Fisher carriage house by accident. She had found it because Joseph had left her a map, a list of 6 addresses written in pencil on a page, glued inside the back cover of his daybook. A list he had kept for 50 years from 1929 until his death in 1972. A list of places where the names were still being spoken. Elena went to work the next morning at Stoltzfus family kitchen and said nothing to anyone about what she had found. But that evening after her shift, she stopped at the county library in Lancaster and asked the librarian for any records related to teamsters or commercial horse-drawn freight in Lancaster County between 1900 and 1960. The librarian, a woman in her 40s named Judith, raised her eyebrows. "That is a very specific request. I am researching my family," Elena said. "What was your family's trade?" "Teamstering. My great-grandfather drove grain wagons from Bethlehem to Lancaster in the 20s and 30s. Judith smiled. "You might want to talk to the Mennonite heritage people. They have been collecting oral histories from the old teamster families for 20 years. There is a small archive at the Heritage Center in Lititz." Elena drove to Lititz the following Saturday. The Mennonite Heritage Education Center was a small brick building on a quiet street lined with sycamore trees. Inside, a woman at the front desk directed Elena to the archive room in the basement. The archive was a single windowless room lined with filing cabinets and shelves of labeled boxes. A young man sat at a desk in the corner, typing on a laptop. He looked up when Elena entered. "Can I help you? I am looking for information on teamsters who worked in Lancaster County in the 1920s and 30s. The young man gestured to the filing cabinets. "We have oral history transcripts organized by family name, and we have a few original daybooks that families have donated. What family are you researching, Novak?" "And Fisher." The young man stood up and walked to one of the filing cabinets. He pulled open a drawer and flipped through the folders. "We have a Fisher. Jakob Fischer, born 1870, died 1952, ran a grain mill and freight operation out of a carriage house near Stumptown Corners. His son Samuel continued the operation until 1963. He pulled a folder and handed it to Elena. No Novak, though. That name does not appear in our records. Elena opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of pages from Jakob Fischer's daybook, notes about grain shipments, records of horses bought and sold. And on one page dated August 1929, a single line met J. Novak of Bethlehem today. A good Hungarian. Gave him Wolfgang's brass, he understands. Elena looked up at the young man. Do you have any other records from the Fischer family? Just what is in that folder? The family donated the materials in the 90s after Samuel died. He paused. Why are you researching this? I bought the Fischer carriage house last year. I am trying to understand its history. The young man's expression changed. You bought the old Fischer place? Yes. He sat down at his desk and opened a drawer. He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. You should talk to Maren Byler. She runs the Heritage Education program here. She has been trying to document the history of the old carriage houses for years. Most of them are gone now. The Fischer place is one of the last ones still standing. He smiled. She would very much like to meet you. Elena called the number on the card that evening. Maren Byler answered on the second ring. Elena explained who she was and what she had found. The carriage house, the hidden compartment, the daybooks, the connection between Joseph Novak and Jakob Fischer. Maren listened without interrupting. When Elena finished, Maren said quietly, Miss Novak, what you have found is extraordinary. We have been looking for evidence of cross-cultural collaboration among the Teamster families for years. Most of the records were lost or destroyed. What you have is a primary source document of a relationship between a Hungarian immigrant Teamster and a Pennsylvania Dutch Teamster in the late 20s. That is rare. That is important. She paused. I would very much like to see the carriage house and the daybooks if you would allow it. Elena met Maren at the carriage house the following Saturday. Maren was a woman in her early 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a braid, and the kind of calm, focused energy that comes from spending a life doing work that matters. She walked through the carriage house slowly, reading the name plaques on each stall, running her hand over the oak beams, examining the hand-forged hinges. When Elena showed her the tack room with the 37 brasses mounted on the walls, Maren stood very still for a long time. Then she said, This is not just a building. This is a monument. She turned to Elena. Have you thought about what you want to do with this place? I want to keep it, Elena said. I want people to know what it was, what it meant. Maren nodded. Then I would like to help you. The Heritage Center has a small grant program for historical preservation education. If you are willing to open the carriage house to school groups and researchers, we can provide funding for interpretive materials, brochures, signage, documentation. How much? Not a lot. Maybe $2,000 or $3,000. But it would be enough to get you started. Elena looked at the 2 walls of brasses, 31 Hungarian names on the left, 6 German names on the right, 37 animals whose names 2 men had decided to preserve. She thought about Samuel Fisher sealing the compartment in 1963, writing his letter to someone he would never meet. She thought about Joseph Novak keeping a list of 6 addresses for 50 years, leaving it hidden in his daybook for a granddaughter he would never know. She thought about Magda teaching a 6-year-old girl to memorize 31 names without explaining why. And she understood that what she was being asked to do now was the same thing those 3 people had done. To say the names, to keep saying them, to make sure they did not disappear. "Yes," she said, "I will open it." The Fisher-Novak Teamstering Heritage Center opened on a Saturday morning in April of 2018, 55 years to the month after Samuel Fisher had sealed the compartment in the hayloft. Elena had worked through the winter preparing the building. She had cleaned every stall. She had swept the hayloft floor. She had mounted the 2 daybooks in climate-controlled display cases in the tack room open to the pages from August 1929, where Joseph and Jakob had written about their meeting. Maren Byler had helped her write the interpretive text for small plaques mounted beside each stall. The plaques explain the history of the building, the lives of the horses, and the tradition of harness brasses among Pennsylvania teamsters. On the morning of the opening, 24 fourth-grade students from a Lancaster elementary school arrived in a yellow bus with their teacher, a woman named Maren Zimmerman, who had taught Pennsylvania history for 30 years. Elena met them at the mounting block outside the main stable door. She had not slept the night before. She had sat in her apartment going over what she wanted to say, how she wanted to explain the building and the brasses and the names. But now, standing in front of 24 children and their teacher in the cold April sunlight, all of her prepared words felt wrong. She opened the stable door and led them inside. The children were quiet at first, the way children are when they enter a space that feels old and important. They walked the central aisle, slowly reading the name plaques on each stall door. One boy, small and dark-haired, stopped at the door marked Hannah. "Why do they all have names?" he asked. Elena knelt down beside him so they were at the same height. "Because the people who worked with these horses believed that names mattered. They believed that if you did not say a name, that name would disappear. And if the name disappeared, it would be like that animal had never lived at all." The boy thought about this. "But they are dead now," he said. "All of them. A long time ago." "Yes," Elena said. "They are. So why do we still say their names?" Elena looked at the small oak plaque with Hannah carved into it. She thought about Samuel Fisher writing his letter in 1963. She thought about her grandmother Magda teaching her 31 names when she was 6 years old. She thought about Joseph and Jakob, 2 men who had met once on a road and had decided that the names of their animals were worth preserving. "Because saying a name is how we remember," she said. "And remembering is how we keep things alive, even after they are gone." The boy nodded slowly as if this made sense to him. The teacher, Maren, came to stand beside Elena. "Can they see the brasses?" she asked quietly. Elena stood up. Yes. She led the children into the tack room where the 37 brasses hung on the two walls. The children pressed forward, wanting to touch them, but Elena held up her hand. "You can touch them," she said, "but only if you wear these." She held up a box of white cotton gloves. "The oil from your hands can damage the bronze, so we wear gloves to protect them." She handed each child a pair of gloves. The children pulled them on carefully, solemnly, as if they were being trusted with something important. Then Elena stepped aside and let them approach the brasses. The children moved slowly along the walls, reading the names stamped into the bronze. Some of them traced the letters with their gloved fingers. Others leaned in close to examine the designs stamped into the faces. Grain sheaves and wagon wheels and plow blades. One girl, maybe 10 years old, stopped in front of the brass-marked Istvan. She turned to Elena. "How do you say this name?" Elena came to stand beside her. "Istvan," she said. "It is Hungarian." The girl repeated it carefully. "Istvan." "Good," Elena said. "What does it mean?" "It is a name. Like Sarah or Mary. It does not mean anything except the person or animal who has it." The girl looked at the brass for a long moment. "My grandmother's name was Ilona," she said. "She came from Hungary. She died last year." Elena felt something catch in her chest. "Ilona is a beautiful name," she said quietly. The girl nodded. She touched the brass gently with one gloved finger. "I am going to remember Istvan," she said, "because someone should." Before the children left, Elena gathered them in the central aisle and read aloud the 37 names. She read them slowly, giving each name its full pronunciation. The Hungarian names in her grandmother's accent. The German names in the careful Pennsylvania Dutch pronunciation Isaac had taught her. Karoly, Istvan, Lajos, Jolan, Margit, Erzsébet, König, Kaiser, Wolfgang, Augusta, Frida, Hannah. The children listened quietly. Some of them mouthed the names as Elena said them, trying to remember. When she finished, Maren Zimmerman came forward and shook her hand. "This is important work you are doing," she said. "These children will remember this." Over the next year, Elena hosted school groups twice a month. She gave tours to historical societies and genealogy clubs. She answered questions from researchers studying Pennsylvania teamstering and immigrant labor history. The work did not pay. The small grant from the Heritage Center covered materials and basic maintenance, but nothing more. Elena continued working dinner shifts at Stoltzfus Family Kitchen 6 nights a week. But the carriage house was no longer empty. The names were being spoken again. And that Elena had come to understand was the point. On a Thursday evening in July of 2019, Elena was closing the restaurant after the dinner shift when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. An Allentown area code. She answered. "Is this Elena Novak?" "Yes. This is Bela Kovac. I own the bakery on Tilghman Street in Allentown. I know your mother." Elena's hand tightened on the phone. Is she all right? There was a pause. She had an accident. She fell on the stairs outside the apartment 2 days ago. Broke her leg in 3 places. She is at St. Luke's Hospital. She has been asking for you. Elena closed her eyes. Is anyone with her? No. The man she was living with left about 2 weeks ago. She has been alone. Elena stood very still in the empty restaurant. She had not spoken to her mother in 20 months. Not since the Saturday evening when Katerina had told her it was time to have her own life. 20 months during which Elena had built a life in Lancaster County, a job, an apartment, a carriage house she was slowly transforming into something permanent. 20 months during which she had not allowed herself to think too much about the woman who had chosen a man over her daughter and had been left by that man anyway. Tell her I will be there tomorrow, Elena said. She hung up and stood in the quiet restaurant for a long time. Then she called Miriam Stoltzfus and asked for 3 days off. Elena drove to Allentown the next morning in a borrowed car. She arrived at St. Luke's Hospital just after noon. Katerina was in a room on the 4th floor. Elena stood outside the door for a full minute before she knocked. Come in, Katerina's voice said. Elena opened the door. Her mother was sitting up in the hospital bed, her right leg in a cast from ankle to hip, elevated on pillows. She looked smaller than Elena remembered, thinner. Her hair had gone gray at the temples. Katerina looked at her daughter and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said quietly, You did not have to come. Elena came into the room and set her bag down on the chair beside the bed. I know. Katerina looked away toward the window. Garrett left, she said, 2 weeks after you did. He found someone else, younger. She said it without emotion, as if she were reporting the weather. Elena sat down in the chair. I am sorry. Katerina shook her head. Do not be. I made my choice. I chose wrong. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Katerina said, Bela told me you bought a building in Lancaster County. An old carriage house. Yes. Why? Because I needed a place to hang Najimama's brasses. Katerina turned to look at her daughter. You still have those? Elena nodded. All 31. And 6 more I found in the building. Katerina's expression changed slightly. 6 more. The carriage house belonged to a German teamster named Jakob Fischer. His son sealed them in a hiding place in 1963. I found them when I bought the building. She paused. Dedapa knew Jakob Fischer. They met in 1929. They exchanged brasses. 8 of Najimama's brasses came from the Fischer family. Katerina stared at her. How do you know this? I found it in their daybooks. Both of them wrote about the meeting. They agreed to keep each other's horses' names alive. Katerina was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Your grandmother would have loved that. I know. Another silence. Then Katerina said, I am sorry, Elena, for what I did, for asking you to leave. Elena looked at her mother's face, the new lines around her eyes, the gray in her hair, the way her hands lay folded on the white hospital blanket, thin and still. She thought about what she wanted to say, about the anger she had carried for 20 months, about the nights in the cousin's apartment in Reading when she had felt utterly alone, about the humiliation of being told to leave her own home because a man her mother barely knew wanted the space. But she also thought about the carriage house, about the foundation she had learned to repair stone by stone, joint by joint across the cold months of winter, about what Isaac had told her, that you could not rush the work, that the mortar needed time to cure between each course of stone, that if you tried to build too fast, the whole wall would fail. Forgiveness, she understood now, was like that. I am not ready to forgive you completely, Ilana said. Not yet. Katerina nodded. I understand. But I am here, and I will help you. Katerina's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Elena stayed in Allentown for 2 weeks. She slept in her old room above the bakery in the apartment that still smelled like rising dough, and her grandmother's herb garden on the windowsill. The room felt smaller than she remembered. The walls were bare where Magda's photograph had hung. The shelf where the harness brasses had been displayed was empty, but it was still the room where she had grown up. And being there in the quiet hours of the early morning when the bakers downstairs were firing the ovens felt like visiting a place she had once lived but no longer belonged to. She went to the hospital twice a day. She helped her mother with meals. She read to her from the Allentown paper. She listened to the things Katerina needed to say about Garrett and the apartment and the loneliness of the months after Magda had died. Katerina did not ask for forgiveness again. She simply talked, and Elena listened. On the evening of the 10th day, Katerina said, Tell me about the carriage house. Elena described the building, the limestone walls, the 6 stalls, the oak staircase to the hayloft, the hidden compartment behind the 8th plank, the letter from Samuel Fisher. She told her mother about learning masonry from Isaac, about the school groups who came to see the brasses, about the girl who had said she would remember Istvan because someone should. Katerina listened without interrupting. When Elena finished, Katerina said, Can I see it? Elena looked at her mother. The cast on her leg, the wheelchair beside the bed. You cannot walk. I can sit in a car. I can sit in a wheelchair. It is 2 hours away. I know. Why do you want to see it? Because it is where my daughter lives now. And because I want to see what you built. 4 days later, on a Saturday morning, Elena borrowed a wheelchair from the hospital and drove her mother to Lancaster County. They drove in silence for most of the trip. Katerina looked out the window at the farmland rolling past, the tobacco fields, the dairy farms, the small towns with their white church steeples. When they turned onto Stumptown Road, Katerina leaned forward slightly. Is that it? Yes. Katerina stared at the carriage house on the knoll, the limestone walls, the slate roof, the tall barn-red stable door. "It is beautiful," she said, quietly. Elena parked the car at the base of the rise. She helped her mother into the wheelchair and pushed her up the gravel path to the mounting block. She unlocked the stable door and slid it open. The afternoon light fell through the door and lit the central aisle. Dust floated in the shafts of light. The air smelled of old oak and stone. Elena pushed the wheelchair slowly down the aisle, stopping at each stall so her mother could read the name plaques. When they reached the tack room, Elena opened the door. Katerina rolled herself forward and looked at the two walls of brasses. 31 on the left, 6 on the right. She sat very still. Then she said in Hungarian, "Ezek Najimama Lovai." "These are grandmother's horses, yes." Katerina reached up and touched one of the brasses through the glass of the frame. The one marked Karoli. She was very quiet for a long time. Then she began to cry. Not loudly, just silent tears running down her face. Elena knelt beside the wheelchair. "Anya," she said softly. Katerina shook her head. "I am not sad. I am proud." She looked at her daughter. "Your grandmother spent 14 years teaching you those names. She never told me why it mattered so much. I thought it was just an old woman's nostalgia. But it was not nostalgia. It was this." She gestured to the walls. "She was teaching you to build this. She was teaching you to remember." Elena took her mother's hand. "She taught both of us." Katerina stayed for 4 days. Elena set up a cot in the tack room of the carriage house so her mother could sleep there. They ate simple meals. They talked about Magda, about Yosef, about the years in the apartment above the bakery. On the 3rd evening, Katerina asked if she could help with the educational materials for the school groups. "I can translate," she said. "The Hungarian names, the terms from Dedapa's daybook. Most people do not know how to pronounce them correctly." Elena nodded. "That would help." They worked together for 2 days going through the interpretive plaques and the brochures Marin Byler had helped create. Katerina wrote out phonetic pronunciations for each Hungarian name and term. She explained the cultural context of certain words. She corrected small errors in the translations. It was quiet work, patient work. The kind of work that did not require apologies or explanations. Just 2 women sitting side by side doing something useful. On the morning Katerina was due to return to Allentown, she said, "I am not asking you to come back. I know, but I would like to visit again, if that is all right." Elena looked at her mother. The cast on her leg, the new quietness in her face. "Yes," she said. "You can visit." Katerina nodded. "Thank you." Over the next 2 years, Katerina came to Lancaster County every other month. She stayed for a few days each time. She helped Elena with translations and research. She attended some of the school group visits and told the children stories about growing up in Hungary, about her own grandmother who had been a girl. When the last horse-drawn wagons were still common in the villages outside Debrecen, the relationship between them was not what it had been before. It was quieter, more careful. But it was also more honest. They did not talk about Garrett. They did not talk about the Saturday evening when Katerina had asked Elena to leave. They simply worked together. And slowly, stone by stone, joint by joint, they rebuilt something that could hold. In October of 2021, Elena turned 23. She marked the day by sitting on the limestone mounting block outside the carriage house in the late afternoon light, watching the sun sink toward the ridge of hills to the west. 3 years had passed since she had bought the building for $10. 3 years during which she had learned to mix mortar and set stone and point a joint. 3 years during which she had turned an abandoned carriage house into a place where the names of 37 horses were spoken aloud several times a month by children who had never seen a draft horse in their lives. 3 years during which she had learned that forgiveness was not a single moment, but a long, slow process, that you could not rush it, that the mortar needed time to cure. She thought about her great-grandfather Joseph landing in Bethlehem in 1919 with $11 in his pocket, about Magda coming to Allentown in 2002 at the age of 81 because her daughter needed help, about Samuel Fisher sealing the compartment in 1963 with a letter addressed to someone he would never meet. She thought about all the choices those people had made, the things they had preserved, the things they had passed on, and she thought about what she was doing now, continuing that work, saying the names, teaching others to say them. The sound of footsteps on gravel made her look up. A man was walking up the rise toward the carriage house. He was older, maybe 75, with white hair and a slight stoop to his shoulders. He walked with a cane. Behind him, a girl of about 10 walked slowly, matching his pace. Elena stood up. "Can I help you?" The man stopped at the mounting block. He looked at the carriage house, then at Elena. "I am Isaac Stoltzfus," he said. "I taught you masonry 3 years ago." Elena smiled. "I remember." "Hello, Isaac." Isaac gestured to the girl beside him. "This is my granddaughter, Lena. She has been asking to meet you." The girl looked at Elena with serious, dark eyes. "Grandpa says you can teach me the names of the horses." Elena looked at Isaac. He nodded. "She has been reading about the carriage house in school. She wants to learn." Elena knelt down so she was at Lena's height. "There are 37 names. They are in Hungarian and German. Some of them are hard to pronounce." Lena nodded. "I know. Grandpa told me. But I want to learn them anyway." Elena studied the girl's face, the seriousness, the determination. She thought about herself at 6 years old, sitting on her grandmother's lap, learning to say Karoi and Istvan and Lajos. "All right," she said. "We can start today if you want." Lena nodded. Elena stood up and led them into the carriage house, down the central aisle, to the tack room. She opened the door and turned on the light. The 37 brasses gleamed on the 2 walls. Lena stood very still, looking at them. Then she said quietly, "There are so many." "Yes," Elena said. 37. "Your grandfather's grandfather knew some of these horses. or knew the men who drove them. Lena looked up at Isaac. "Is that true?" Grandpa Isaac nodded. "My grandfather worked for Jakob Fischer. He helped load the grain wagons. He knew Koenig and Kaiser." Lena turned back to the brasses. "Can you teach me those two first?" Elena smiled. "Yes." She pointed to the first brass on the right wall. "This is Koenig. In German it means king. You say it like this, König." Lena repeated carefully. "König. Good. And this is Kaiser. It means emperor. You say it Kaiser. Kaiser. Very good." Lena looked at the remaining 35 brasses. "How long will it take to learn all of them?" Elena thought about the 3 years she had spent rebuilding the foundation, about the patience Isaac had taught her, about the way you could not rush the work if you wanted it to last. "As long as it takes," she said. "But we will learn them. All 37, if you want to." Lena nodded. "I want to." That evening, after Isaac and Lena had gone, Elena stayed at the carriage house alone. She walked the central aisle in the gathering dark. She did not turn on the lights. She simply stood in the quiet and listened to the building settle around her. She thought about all the people who had stood in this space before her. Jakob Fischer, building the stalls in 1892. Samuel Fischer leading Hannah out for the last time in 1963. Joseph Novak stopping here on a grain run in 1929 to drink coffee with a German teamster and make a promise. And she thought about all the people who would stand here after her. Lena learning the 37 names. Other children. Other families. People who would come to this place and hear the names spoken and understand that remembering mattered. She went into the tack room and stood in front of the 2 walls of brasses. She read the names aloud, all 37, slowly and carefully giving each name its full pronunciation. When she finished, she reached up and placed her hand on 2 brasses, one from each wall. Hannah on the right, the last horse Samuel Fischer had worked, the one he had sent to Ohio in 1963, and Istvan on the left, one of the 8 brasses that bore Jakob Fischer's mark, one of the ones Joseph had received in 1929. She stood there with her hands on the 2 brasses and spoke quietly into the empty room. "Thank you, Uncle Joseph. Thank you, Uncle Samuel. Thank you, Najimama. I will keep saying the names." She thought about the letter Samuel had written 58 years ago, about the line that had stayed with her from the first time she had read it. A name that is not spoken is a name that is going away. She understood now what he had meant. It was not just about the horses. It was about everyone. Every person who had lived and worked and loved and passed on. Every choice that had mattered. Every small act of preservation that had kept something alive. Saying the names was how you kept the past from disappearing. It was how you built a foundation that would hold. Elena locked the carriage house and walked back to her apartment through the October dark. The air was cold. The stars were bright overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. She thought about the work ahead. The school groups scheduled for the spring. The research Marin Byler wanted to do on the connection between immigrant Teamsters and Pennsylvania Dutch families. The translations her mother was still working on. And she thought about Lena, 10 years old, serious and determined, wanting to learn 37 names because her grandfather had said they mattered. Elena climbed the stairs to her apartment and unlocked the door. Inside, on the shelf above the kitchenette, Joseph's daybook and Samuel's daybook sat side by side. On the wall opposite the bed, Magda's photograph looked out at her. A young woman in a Bethlehem stable yard in 1950, standing beside a bay horse smiling. Elena sat down on the bed and looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she said quietly in Hungarian, "Nagymama látod megtartottam a neveket." "Grandmother, do you see I kept the names?" And for a moment, in the quiet of the small apartment above the woodworking shop, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice answering. "Jól csináltad, kislányom. You did well, my girl." Elena turned off the light and lay down. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare branches of the trees. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. And in the carriage house 800 yards away, 37 harness brasses hung on 2 walls in the dark, waiting for the next morning when someone would come and say the names again. She was 19 and homeless when she bought the building. She was 23 now, and she had a home. Not because she had bought it with $10, but because she had learned that a home is not just a place. It is a continuity. It is a promise kept. It is the choice to say the names of the people and the animals who came before you, and to teach those names to the people who will come after. And if you are lucky, if you are patient, if you work stone by stone and joint by joint and season by season, you build something that will stand long after you are gone, something that will hold.